What's up, cooks? Welcome to the Card Kitchen. I am the Card Chef, and today we are cooking up a meta report breaking down all the win rates and meta shares of all the best decks in the game. So let's get right into it. So let's get into the meta share breakdown. And of course, the decks that we're looking at are the Greninja Tech Box decks, the Celebi Executor decks, the Gyarados Greninja decks, the Aerodactyl decks with either Primeape or Farfetch'd, the Charizard decks that are Charizard and Arcanine specifically, the Arcanine decks with Moltres and Mew, the Pikachu decks with Zebstrika, and the Mewtwo Gardevoir decks. And as you can see, not much has changed. The meta is still remaining the same. The Greninja decks, and in case you don't know, these are the Greninja decks. I call them Greninja Box or Greninja Tech Box, and is basically the Greninja lines with things like Marshadow and Hitmonlee and Farfetch'd, or with things like a Druddigon and Tauros, or Druddigon and Mew, or Druddigon, Mew, and Tauros. So those decks are still at a 2% meta share. In fact, these decks are super duper high up on the win rate. They actually have the Hitmonlee, Marshadow, Farfetch'd versions are actually the highest win rates in the game right now with 54%. We'll get into that a little bit later, but this deck is still sitting around a 2%, even though it has one of the highest win rates in the game. And then when you move on to Celebi EX, this is the Executor EX version where you have two Executor EX and not just one, and then one baby Executor. This is still only around a 5% meta share, which is kind of crazy because this too has a very high win rate. In fact, it has the second highest win rate in the game right now with also 54%, but just under, if we're going to get into the actual percentage points, is 53.99%. And so I'm very surprised that these two decks have such low meta share when you consider the fact they have such high win rates. Now moving on, we got the Gyarados EX, probably one of the strongest decks in the game. I think it's number 2 just behind Pikachu, but still sitting at like a 12% meta share. And then we get into the Aerodactyl decks. Now these decks specifically, I did start to look, previously I was just looking at the Farfetch'd build of it without the primates in it, but now I'm looking at both combined. They're both very similar, and I would like to see a more broader meta share from that deck to see how many other people are playing other versions, to kind of give an idea to the viewer that this deck is being played more than just that one deck. And the meta share and the win rates, like I said, for the two different versions of those decks are starting to come closer and closer. So we looked at both of those versions of the deck, which gave it a 4% meta share. Now we're getting into the fire decks. The Charizard EX is a 3% meta share, and the Arcanine is a 2%. So very, very close. I still think the Arcanine builds are the better version, even though they do have a little bit lower of a win rate and a lower meta share. I actually do prefer the Arcanine build myself. Now moving on, the Pikachu deck. This is only the Pikachu Zebstrika. It's only because I could add the Raichu builds, because the Raichu builds do have a decent win rate over 50% and are still pretty strong, but the Zebstrika just has a massive meta share compared to the Raichu build, and is just way better in the current meta, and is clearly the best version of the deck. It gets the most tops, has the highest win rate, has the highest meta share, and wins the most tournaments of all the Pikachu decks. So I didn't seem like the Aerodactyl decks necessary to add the Raichu builds in here. Now moving on to the last deck, we got Mewtwo EX and Gardevoir, still at a 18% meta share. This deck is still super duper popular. A ton of people play it. It won the most tournaments this week. If you watched my top 10 decks of the week this week, you would have found out that it won 3 tournaments and had a tremendous showing. Now with that being said, let's get in to the win rates. So this is the win rate portion of the video, and as you can see, all the same decks are up on the screen. So let's just get into them. As you can see, the Greninja Tech Box decks, if you take all the different versions, the Druddigon Tauros builds, the Druddigon Mew builds, the Hitmonlee Farfetch'd, and Marshadow builds, I put them all together in one. They could technically be separated. They're not the exact same decks, but I felt like they're Greninja shells that aren't Gyarados, so I felt like putting them together this week, and so that's what I did, and it's around a 52% win rate. But again, the Farfetch'd Hitmonlee Marshadow build is the highest win rate in the game right now, with an above 54% win rate. And of course, as we mentioned as well, the Celebi EX is also a 54% win rate, specifically 53.99%. Now, funny enough, the one deck that was a Celebi deck that actually did win a tournament this week was not the version with 2 Executor EX, which is the one with the 54% win rate. But this deck is still the better deck. It still wins the most games overall and has an above average win rate and above all other decks in the game, except for the Farfetch'd Hitmonlee, Marshadow, and Greninja build. Now, moving on to the Gyarados deck, 53%. So this actually, the more I see this week to week, 53% is obviously very good, but when you see it on par with things like Aerodactyl and as well as Charizard, you start to think about this deck a little bit differently. Now, at the end of the day, this deck does win a lot more tournaments than all those other decks. In fact, I don't think I've actually ever seen Aerodactyl win a tournament though, but it does make you think like, maybe some of these decks are a little bit stronger. But of course, it's definitely still a lot better than a lot of the decks. 2 of the decks in the top of the meta with Arcanine and Charizard are water, so you're just going to be able to knock them out very easily, and your Gyarados feels very much like a Charizard EX, being able to basically one-shot anything once you combine Druddigon and Greninja with your 140 attack from the Gyarados. So moving on to Aerodactyl, again, just like Gyarados, a 53% win rate, and this has taken the combination of the 2 Aerodactyl builds, the Farfetch'd build and the Primate build, and it's still around a 53% win rate. And then the Charizard deck is the Charizard Arcanine Moltres build, and this as well is a 53% win rate, but as I said, it doesn't really win as much tournaments as the Gyarados, but it is still winning. It didn't win this week, but last week, the week before, the previous meta report I did, it did win 2 tournaments, so it is still a very strong deck. I just think it has too many weaknesses. One, it's weak to a ton of decks right now because there's Gyarados decks, there's Greninja decks that allow Greninja to actually attack, and it just plays, I think, in my opinion, way too many EX Pokemon. It's playing often things like 2 Arcanine, 2 Charizard, 2 Moltres, and sometimes even 1 Mew EX. That's 6 to 7 Pokemon that are EX in the deck sometimes. It's just way too much free value for your opponent when they're knocking you out. And then as we get into the Arcanine build, the 52%. So this is actually lower than a lot of the decks and lower than the Charizard build, but I still think, again, that the Arcanine build is better. It just has way less cards in regards to the amount of Pokemon you're playing in the deck, which allows you to play more trainers in your deck to have more options to be able to do other things. You're also playing sometimes less EX Pokemon, so it's not a ton of extra free value in regards to the amount of prizes you're giving to your opponent every time something gets knocked out. So I just like that build a little bit better. And then Pikachu at a 53% win rate as well. Still the king in my opinion. It did win a tournament this week. However, over the last couple of previous weeks, it has been winning not one but multiple tournaments every single week. I still think it's the strongest deck in the game. Even if it's not the highest win rate, it's still the best deck in the game in my opinion. And then the Mewtwo EX, a 50% win rate. This deck has always been around that 50%, and I think it's honestly due to a couple of things. It's really strong into like half of the meta, and it's really weak into like half of the meta. So it's able to be like one-shotted by Charizard decks, Celebi decks, as well as Gyarados decks, and it's also it's hard to get around certain breakpoints. It doesn't automatically knock out things like Executor, it doesn't automatically knock out Gyarados, and it doesn't automatically knock out Charizard because of their HP count. And then when you get into the other decks, a lot of these decks can out aggro a Mewtwo deck, but those decks are also really weak against Mewtwo because Mewtwo can one-shot a lot of those Pokemon. It could one-shot the Pikachu, the Arcanine, the Aerodactyl, the Celebi, the Mew EX, and stuff like that. But then also because it has the highest meta share every single week, there is probably a ton of mirror matches as well, which means every time a Mewtwo Gardevoir deck faces a Mewtwo Gardevoir deck, it is automatically going to be a 50% win rate, because win or lose on either side, it's always a 50% win. And now what we're going to do is we're going to get into the first place finishes portion of the video. So this is the decks that won tournaments this week. As you can see, Gyarados won one tournament, Arcanine won one tournament, Pikachu won one tournament, and Mewtwo won 3 tournaments. And then there was one deck that I consider other. I could have considered it a Celebi Executor deck because it was a Celebi Executor deck. It was the Celebi Superior Executor build, except it's not the one that we look for in the data when looking at the meta share and win rates, because that one again is the one with the 2 Executor EX. This deck did not play the 2 Executor EX, so it is considered a different deck and has a totally different meta share and win rate than the one that plays the 2 Executor EX. In fact, this one plays 1 Executor EX and 1 baby Executor, and the one it specifically played was the one from Mythical Island, and this deck got first place in a tournament this week. And funny enough, that deck did not run into a single fire deck the entire tournament, which is pretty insane to think. But now let's get into the other decks here. Obviously, Gyarados, Pikachu, and Mewtwo are basically always making a first place finish somewhere in the meta. I'm usually only ever looking at tournaments with 250 or more players, and all these decks won this week. And you will definitely always see Pikachu. There will be those off weeks where you don't see Gyarados, but you often don't not see it. Like, it usually is still there, and you do usually see some kind of a Mewtwo, but not as often as Pikachu. And then you always see 1 or maybe 2 fire decks, either being the Arcanine or the Charizard. This week it so happened to be Arcanine, but the big deck of the week was Mewtwo EX. And you know what? This deck is just very, very, very strong. And because you got to think of it this way, not only are you hitting for 150, so you're knocking out a ton of people, but because you're kind of playing on curve in the sense, once you get 2 energy on it, you're hitting for 50. And then once you get 4, you're hitting for 150. So if you're hitting into like a big EX Pokemon, that will not be knocked out with 150, because you go 2 energy, 50, 3 energy, then 1 from Gardevoir, making it 4. So across 2 turns, you're doing 200 damage, HP worth of damage. So Mewtwo is very strong into a ton of decks. It also has the largest meta share, so it is very often that you're going to be able to see one of these decks win just because there's so many of them being played. So it actually has like the highest chance of winning the tournament based on just its meta share alone. So these are the decks. And again, even when there are those weeks there, Mewtwo often will, or not often, but will beat out Pikachu in the amount of tournaments that it's won. I still think the three best decks are three that you see on the screen. It's Pikachu, Gyarados, and Mewtwo, and I think it's in that order. I think Pikachu is just too strong. It's too fast. It takes out decks that are stronger than it in regards to the amount of power it could output, because you could just out-aggro them and get them out of the game before they even get online. I think Gyarados is one of the strongest decks because it honestly can just knock out anything in the meta, and it's not as hard to do as it is with the Charizard, in my opinion. And I think Mewtwo is just the best. The third best deck. I think it has one of the better deck builds. Being able to play the Mythical Slab now just has increased this deck's power like you wouldn't believe. You're able to get those Gardevoir lines online a lot quicker. It still has the same power output. And now you have things like a Mew EX to add into that deck to make it even stronger. And then you also have things like Jinx, which are actually, in my opinion, a lot more stronger now than they were in the previous meta, the Genetic Apex meta, because even though Jinx was pretty strong against things like Mewtwo and Charizard, now we have those two decks, as well as decks like Gyarados and Celebi, who also take a ton of energy. So the value of something like a Jinx just goes up incredibly. So that is it for this week's meta report. I hope you liked the video. Leave a comment in the comments section below. Like, subscribe, and share. Join the Discord so that when trading comes out and near the end of the month, I think is when it's actually going to drop alongside the A2 set, you can come on into the Discord, meet everybody else who might be in the community by that time, and start trading cards. But anyways, with that being said, as always, keep cooking.